Hey, what is up guys? Welcome back to the channel where I teach you iOS development by building an application from the Apple App Store. So today is part 2 of the how to build the Facebook Messenger chat application, and make sure to get caught up by clicking on part 1 if you've missed it earlier. And we have already built out the UI. So I'm going to go into Xcode and run the application to show you what we have with the code so far. So looking at the simulator, we have 3 rows. All is just repeating Mark Zuckerberg for the name and the image and the text so far. And let's take a look at what we have in our final product here. And notice how each one of these rows are what we call dynamic, and the images, text, and all that is just based on data that's backing the UI collection view. So notice when I click in here, I get the chat log for the friend inside of this row. Now, before I go into core data, I think it's a lot more helpful to illustrate what my class and model objects are going to be. And what I mean is I'm going to go into friends controller up here, and I'm going to use 2 models to represent each one of these rows right here. And the first of which is going to be this message class here. And we'll use NSObject for the subclass. And now we have 2 properties. The first is going to be text for the actual text inside of the message, using string as a property or the type. And next we'll use date as NSDate, like that. And that is when the friend sends you the message. The final piece of information that message will hold is the friend property, like this. I'm just going to create it right there. And I'm going to create this friend class up here. Friend, NSObject, just like that. Nothing too special about friend, but having the name property, and also for convenience, we'll use profile image name up here. And this is going to reference what we have in our assets catalog as the image. Okay, now that we have our message object set up, we can set up the data source for our friends controller to represent each one of these rows here. And what I mean is I'm going to create a messages array like that as an optional, and I'm going to set up the data for messages inside of this function here. So private function, well, let's just remove the private for now, and we'll call this setup data. And here we'll set up just one friend for now, and that friend will be Mark, and he'll be a friend object like that. Mark.name is Mark Zuckerberg. Hope I'm spelling that correctly. And Mark.profile image name will be Zuck underscore, nope, no underscore, profile. And now we want to specify this message class here. So message, let's call this Mark, let's call this a message for now. Message, and message.friend will be Mark that we just created above. And next we specify the actual text up here. So Mark will say, hello, my name is Mark, nice to meet you, like that. And finally we'll use a date of right now. So it's currently 5:07. And we're going to use that to populate this row here with a name, text, and then the time right there on the right. Cool. Last bit of information we need to do is to set this messages array inside of our controller class to just contain that single message. Okay, now if we run the app, nothing's going to change just yet until we change this bit here. So number of items in section will just be this messages.count. However, that's not going to work until we safely unwrap this count variable and return it upon success. Otherwise, return 0 if messages is nil. Now, the next thing I want to do is I actually want to change the name of this friend cell to message cell to better reflect the model object that I'm going to send into it. So I'm going to change that there and there. And now, if we run it, everything is fine. Okay. Hopefully everything's fine. Okay, so now we're now returning 0 instead of the hard-coded 3. And we want to change the cell to be this. So cell, inside of this cell for item at index path method, we'll downcast this cell as message cell, like that. And then we'll return the cell. So in here, I want to actually get access to the actual message inside of that row, which will be this. If let message equals messages question mark index path dot item, I'll say cell dot message is this message variable that I just unwrapped. Now this cell doesn't have this message property yet, so let's go ahead and create it like this. Let's see, message, and we'll execute some code upon setting it right here in line 84, corresponding to line 69 right there. Now the first thing I want to do is to change the name label dot text to something, right? And name label dot text will be message dot name dot friend dot name, right? And so we need to unwrap this with a question mark like that and build. Okay. And the one final thing we need to do is actually call this method called setupData inside of our view.load right here. And paren. Let's run this and we'll see one row with this Mark Zuckerberg name, and everything looks okay so far. So let's finish up setting the rest of the view components inside of this row. So for example, the profile image view will be the image that we specify inside of the friend object. So let's use friend as, let's see, your image named message.friend.profile image name. So this needs to be safely unwrapped. Profile image name equals that. And finally, let's put that inside the if condition and say profile image name. And now we are going to set the text label like this. So message label is the actual label for the text, and that'll be message.text like that. Finally, we can specify what this time label should be. But first, let's run the application to see what we have inside of the row. So we have Mark Zuckerberg, the name, and the text, hello, my name is Mark. That's showing up pretty nicely. And finally, this image here has not changed, but the time label is something that we want to modify. So the time label is here, and text needs to be something, right? So let's unwrap this date object by saying if let date equals message.date. So we now have a handle on this date object, and we need to set this time label text to something. And that something will be retrieved from a date formatter object like this. And date formatter has a date format property, which we'll use h:/mm, and we'll use a like that. And before you ask what that does, let me just show you by running the application using string from date off of date formatter like that. So I'm going to run and show you that the time label now says 5:12 p.m. and that's what that means. So H is just the hour, minutes, and A is the AM PM on the right. So pretty good. And looks like we are in a pretty good spot to start talking about what core data should be. Now, before I get into core data too much, I want to take this function up here. I actually think that there's a lot of code going on right now, so I want to take this and put it in a place easier to read. And that is going to be a new file called friends controller helper like this. And I'm going to do this, import UIKit. And this will be an extension off of friends controller. And I'm just going to replace that or paste that method in here. And if I run now everything looks okay and should be the same as it was before. Next thing I want to do is to cut and paste the model objects up here. So now I have a pretty good place that is kind of away from the controller code to set up my data objects. Now, one more thing I want to do before I tap into core data is create this second row right here. And I'm just going to call that Steve. And the reason why I'm doing this is it's easier to illustrate what's going on with core data if I have two rows instead of just one. So this will be message Steve, like this, like that. And finally, we changed a couple of properties here. So Steve jobs, this will be Steve profile. I'll drag that asset in just a little bit. So he will say Apple creates great iOS devices for the world, ... And next we set message Steve inside of the messages array. I'm going to run that and show you what happens in the second row. So we have Steve jobs for the name, his text is showing up, and the date is the same as it is up there because it is being created almost instantaneously, one after another. Okay, finally, we'll do one more thing, which is to drag in the actual Steve Jobs image file that I have inside of Finder right here. So it's called Steve Profile. And let's open up Assets Catalog and drag that in there, run, and we'll see Steve's nice little face appear right there. So pretty good, right? Now we want to talk about how to use these objects, the friend and the message object, to kind of better model what we want as entities inside of our core data model file right here. And before I add the entities, I want to tell you about what is going on here. So a friend, Steve Jobs, has one message here, but he actually has many messages there. So that's a relationship that we have to establish in just a bit. So the first entity that we want to create is the friend object. Let's just call it friend. And the next one will be message right here. Now, friend will have those two properties that we had earlier. So name and profile image name. They will both be strings like that. And in message, this entity will contain, let's see, what was it? Text and date. Cool. This will be a date attribute type, and this will be a string attribute type. It's pretty straightforward. This pretty much maps directly into our model objects here. And if I hit build, everything looks okay. And here's the trick to core data. I'm going to generate or have Xcode generate these model objects for me by right-clicking, new file, using iOS core data, NSManagedObject subclass, next, select both of them, hit next, and see what we get. So here we have these two objects that contain these two properties here. So it's going to complain that I already have this class defined in this file here. So I'm going to comment this out like that. And everything should be okay with the exception of this friend property here. So friend is okay, it contains name and profile image name. So that looks good. And how we fix this friend error is to go back into our data model file, and we want to create a relationship that will exist from message to friend. So what I mean is go into the relationships area here and call it friend, like that, and destination or friend, and no inverse for now. And the other thing we have to do is to go into friend and create this messages relationship. And I'm going to tell you why in just a second. So let me do this here. Okay. the next thing we're going to do is open up this little button down here. I don't know exactly what it's called, but drag out your little boxes and let's see, let's do this instead. So friend is on the top left and message is on the top right. And when you click on this little messages here, we want to change two things. The first of which is to change to many or to one to use to many. And click on this friend here. And now it's to one, which is good. So go back to messages and want to toggle this no inverse relationship to friend for the inverse. And now we have a data model that better reflects what we want inside our app. In other words, we have a friend that contains many messages, and that's what this arrow here means by the double pointer. And then going back, we have a message which has a friend relationship on it, specified by this, and it is a 2-1 relationship. So now that I have that set up, hopefully you guys are still with me, I'm going to regenerate those two NSManagedObject subclass files by doing the same thing again, hit next, and hit create. And now let's go back to friends controller helper, and you see this friend object is no longer being flagged as an error. So let's go to message dot or plus core data properties, and it has a friend property on it now because of this relationship that we've created inside of our core data file. So let's build and try to run this. And unfortunately, I believe it's going to fail. And let's look at the error up here. So it's saying set name is not recognized for this friend object. And it's pretty strange and not entirely clear what the error is based on this message. So let me just tell you what we have to do to fix it. Basically, core data objects, such as this friend object here, which is now this core data managed object, NSManagedObject, it is no longer a NS object, and we need to create it a little differently. So the actual syntax to create mark will now be NSEntityDescription. So let's just import core data like that and use entity description, insert new object for entity name, and this will be the friend string, and inside here is going to be a context object. Now let me just delete this first and tell you how to get context. So context is actually this variable inside of app_delegate called managedObject_context. So let's get that from app_delegate by doing this. So let delegate equals UI application shared application dot delegate as app_delegate like that. And finally, we get our context by saying if let delegate dot managedObject_context, let's see, actually, if let context equals that, and bracket bracket, we'll execute all this code that sets up our core data objects. So let's just paste that in there. Hopefully you're still with me. And we have this context object now up here. And so having initialized mark up here, I'm going to delete this line here. And then it's going to complain that mark.name is not found on this mark object. And that's because we haven't downcasted it as a friend like that. And see, now that's okay. It's no longer complaining so much anymore. And the other thing we have to do is to specify the same initializer for our Steve friend here. And there we go. So that looks good. Looks good. And finally, let's run the application with all the fixes in place. And now it's going to complain about set friend again. Let's see. And let's see, okay. And the reason is because now message is now saying that friend is not a property, and we fixed that by doing the same thing for friend, but instead for message like that, and we'll downcast that as a message. Okay, and do that. as message and run. Hopefully it's no longer going to crash. And we get this here, pretty good. So Xcode is pretty smart about the entity name. And here we are. So at last we are able to provide data for our collection view using our managed object context, and then these bits of information to create our model objects that are going to be persisted inside of core data. Now the next thing I want to do is actually save this data into core data. And what I mean is every time I launch the application, I'm currently creating all these objects. And we don't want to do that. And instead, we want to save these objects here. So if we execute save on context like this, we can, let's see, .save. And it says that it throws. And what it means is that it's going to throw an error. So we have to catch it here. So let's do a do catch like this. And if there's an error, we'll just print out the error for now. And we have to actually paste that in here. And it's going to complain that we need this try syntax. And we are good to go with the save here. So every time we run the application, we're calling setup data, and then we're saving all of these core data objects into the disk, and it is being saved every time. So if I run that again, we now have a duplicate of these objects. However, you can't see that because I'm just adding it hard-coded inside of this array here. Okay. Now, so let me prove to you that we actually have a duplicate of these objects by loading the data now. So I'm going to comment that out. And if I run that, we get nothing for the collection view. And I'm going to do load data here. So load data is going to be a function called load data. And in here, we need to load these messages object from core data instead of just passing it into this array here. So I'm going to copy this whole thing just to get access to this context object. And I'm going to remove these lines here. And in order to load data, we need a fetch request object called NSFetchRequest. Okay, get some new lines there. And this fetch request will be using entity name for the initializer. And I'm going to get the messages that I've created up here, all these messages objects. And I'm going to fetch it using this context. So context dot execute fetch request with this fetch request here. And it's going to complain about this throw again. So this throws a potential error. And we need to do catch again, like this. And let's cut that and paste it here. Finally, we need to do a try on that piece of code. And now everything is okay in terms of compile errors. So that looks okay. Now we actually have to load this into an array. And what I mean is to actually say messages equals that right there. And it's complaining because we don't have this downcast here. So let's run that now and see what happens when we call load data. So we've called save data numerous times, which means that each save persists all this data into core data, and we finally load it upon hitting line 49, which is what we get here, setting messages to the actual core data models. So that looks pretty good. And the one thing that is very helpful when programming with core data is to actually clear all the data before you do all this data entry stuff. And what I mean is I want to call a method called clear data. And I'm going to call that so that I can get a better representation of the two rows that I've entered, right? So let's just create it up here, func clear data. And finally, we will have to delete all of these objects that we've created that are duplicates. And basically the idea is we clear the data, do the data entry here. Let's just remove this line, no longer needed. And then we call the load data to set up our messages array. And to delete or to clear the actual data on the core data disk, we have to call delete object on this context right here. So let me just copy and paste this bit again in here, just so I can get access to this context variable. And we need to remove that, and let's just remove this as well. We need to call context delete object right there. And we need to actually delete this NSManagedObject, which will be this friend object, or all of the friend objects and all of the message objects. So we first need to actually load it inside of an array. And let's see, what is the easiest way of doing this, right? So let's do this right here. Let fetch request equals NSEntityDescription. Actually, this needs to be NSFetchRequest and entity name of something. So let's use friend for now. And let's just use this. So let friends equals context dot execute fetch request, just like what we did before. And then we'll downcast this as a friends array like that. Get rid of the S. Finally, we need to execute a try on this here. So this returns us all of our friend objects, and let's see, this might be a better example if I use message actually. So let's use message here, and then we'll downcast it as a messages array, and we'll use message here. So messages will be returned here, and then we loop over message like this. So for message in messages like that, let's see, messages, we will call context delete object inside of this loop, and we'll just delete all of these message objects. So we need to actually use pound there. Okay, pretty good. And basically this just unwraps the messages array fetched from core data. So now that we've deleted all of these objects, we need to actually hit save again on context. On context, save, make sure to use try. And this pretty much deletes all of our message objects. So if I run the application now, it's going to clear the data, create my objects here, and then we'll also load it at the very bottom, which sets our messages array. So one final bit of code to clean up the database is to actually delete your friend objects that you've created as well. And to do that, I'm going to specify an array of entity names like this, friend and message, and I'm going to loop over it to perform the delete. So entity name in entity names, entity names like that. We are going to execute all of the deletes up here, and this will just be replaced with entity name. Okay, pretty good. And finally, when we delete all of our objects, we will create a save. So let's do this here. Okay, so it's returning null because we've already previously deleted all of our entity objects, I believe. No, actually, this is the wrong cast now. So we're going to have friends array being returned when we get the friends. Let's remove that. And then remove that. And this will be objects here, objects. And let's just do an if let here, if let. And paste that in here. What do we get? Okay. looks like we cannot do an if let with the try. So let's just go ahead and undo and use object, objects, and objects there. This will be object, this will be object, and hitting run, let's see, can I unwrap? So let's just remove this pound there, and let's see. So this actually will be as NSManagedObject. And here, let's remove that pound, and then we'll say pound. Finally, after all the downcasting and whatnot, we've been able to to actually clear the friend and messages from core data. Whew. So that's pretty good. One thing I see as kind of funny is this profile image there, and I'm just going to fix that by going back into View Controller and finding the cell here. We will say has, I think it has red image view, image is equal this up here. We'll run it, and then we will just bump it up in size, and now we get the actual text, name, image, and date. Okay, so seeing as we are already at the 30-minute mark, this tutorial is going to be a bit long, so I'm going to cut it off here. And so far, we've been able to create and, let's see, create, load, and delete all of our core data objects in this setup data method here. So every time you're working with core data, make sure you have this structure of code so that you can test things a lot easier. And this way, you remove all your duplicate objects as soon as possible. So that's pretty good. The next video is going to be about loading these objects, but instead of just loading one row or one message per row, we're going to be loading multiple messages. In other words, I am going to insert multiple messages for this Steve Jobs friend. So for example, I have roughly 7-8 messages here. And so we're going to insert multiple messages and figure out how to load that message array into this controller so that we don't get duplicate messages. And also we will figure out how to sort the messages based on the latest arrival time of the message date. So hopefully you will, hopefully you're excited for that. It's actually really, really fun. So make sure to like the video down below and hit subscribe to get a notification for whenever that video is released, hopefully in the next 2 days. And aside from that, keep coding and learn more about core data. Yeah, have a nice day. Bye.